Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Agatha Raisin glared at her reflection in the hallway mirror of her cottage in Carsely. She was wearing a dress of Lincoln green silk that she'd bought in a fit of expensive optimism in Cheltenham, paired with a heavy silver brooch she hoped looked vaguely Highland. "You look like a very posh Christmas tree," she muttered to herself. She tugged at the hem, wishing, not for the first time, that she had been born with the kind of effortless, waif-like grace possessed by the women who usually populated the dreams of James Lacey. James, her neighbour and the perpetual object of her frustrated affections, was currently obsessed with the upcoming Burns night supper at the village hall. He had spent the last week practising his address to a haggis, with a fervour usually reserved for military history. Agatha wasn't particularly fond of offal encased in a sheep's stomach, nor was she fond of bagpipes, which she privately thought sounded like a cat being dragged through a vacuum cleaner. However, Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife and the only woman in the Cotswolds Agatha actually liked, had insisted it was for the church roof fund. More importantly, James would be there in a kilt. The evening, however, had gotten off to a wretched start. As Agatha stepped out of her door, she spotted Sheila Cartwright across the road. Sheila was a relative newcomer to Carsely, a woman who managed to be both deeply religious and breathtakingly judgmental. She was currently wearing a tartan sash of such blinding brightness it made Agatha's teeth ache. "Oh, Agatha!" Sheila called out, her voice carrying that specific pitch of manufactured sweetness that always signalled an incoming insult. "How brave of you to wear that shade of green. It's very festive, though perhaps a bit daring for a woman of a certain, well, for the lighting in the hall." Agatha's hand flew to her hair, which she'd spent 40 minutes styling into a sophisticated swirl that now felt like a precarious bird's nest. "It's designer, Sheila, from London. You might have seen it in a magazine, if they deliver those to your part of the village." Sheila's smile didn't falter. "We're also looking forward to the dancing. I do hope your hip is up to a reel. My cousin Alistair is visiting from Edinburgh. He's a real Scot, you know. He's quite the stickler for tradition." Agatha marched toward the village hall, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. "A real Scot," she fumed. "I'll show her a real Scot. I'll drink her under the table with the malt whisky if I have to." The hall was a riot of red and green plaid, smelling of damp wool and simmering turnip. At the head table sat the evening's guest of honour, Alistair Munro. He was a tall, craggy-faced man, with a silver beard and an air of immense self-importance. He was currently holding court, surrounded by the village's A-list, including the local squire and a very bored-looking Bill Wong, Agatha's friend from the Mercer CID. "Agatha," Bill whispered, sliding over to her as she reached the bar. "You look like you're ready to declare war." "I am, Bill. On Sheila Cartwright and anyone who mentions my age or my hip," Agatha snapped. "Who is this Munro character? He looks like he's about to demand a tribute of cattle." "Alistair Munro, a big-shot land developer from up north," Bill explained, nodding toward the head table. "Supposedly a distant relative of Sheila's. He's donated a massive sum to the roof fund, so everyone's treating him like royalty. Though, between you and me, he's been remarkably rude to the catering staff." Agatha watched as Munro barked an order at a young girl carrying a tray of drinks. The girl stumbled, and Munro let out a booming, condescending laugh that turned several heads. "He's a pig," Agatha decided instantly. The evening proceeded with the usual village pomp. James Lacey stood up to deliver the address to a haggis, looking maddeningly handsome in his tartan. Agatha felt a familiar pang of longing, followed by a sharp jab of annoyance when she saw Sheila Cartwright whispering in James's ear as he sat down. Then came the centrepiece of the night. The haggis was paraded in to the skirl of pipes, carried aloft by the village butcher, Mr. Higgins. Alistair Munro stood up. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy purple from the whisky. "A fine beast!" Munro bellowed, grabbing the ceremonial knife. "But in my house we do the honours with a bit more spirit." He pulled a small flask from his sporran, unscrewed it, and poured a dark, viscous liquid over the steaming haggis before plunging the knife into it with unnecessary violence. "To Scotland!" he cried, taking a massive, theatrical mouthful of the steaming meat. The room erupted in polite applause. Munro chewed, his eyes bulging. Then his expression shifted. The boisterous smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. He tried to speak, but only a wet, gargling sound came out. He clutched his throat, his face turning from purple to a terrifying shade of grey-blue. He crashed forward, his head landing squarely in the mashed turnips with a sickening thud. The hall went silent. For a long, frozen second, the only sound was the drone of the bagpipes fading into a wheeze. Agatha pushed her way through the crowd, her PR-trained instincts for drama overriding her common sense. "Get back! Give him air!" she commanded, though it was clear to anyone looking that Alistair Munro didn't need air, he needed a miracle. Bill Wong was already there, fingers pressed to Munro's neck. He looked up at the shocked faces, his gaze lingering on the spilled flask and the half-eaten haggis. "He's dead," Bill said quietly. Agatha looked at the green silk of her dress, now splattered with gravy and turnip. Her social evening was ruined, her dress was a write-off, and a man was dead in the neeps. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Agatha muttered, her sharp eyes catching a glint of something unusual on the rim of the dead man's flask. "The one night I wanted a decent drink, and someone has to go and get themselves murdered." The silence in the village hall was shattered not by a scream, but by the heavy rhythmic sobbing of Sheila Cartwright. She had collapsed into her chair, her bright tartan sash trailing in a puddle of spilled ale. "My cousin," she wailed, though Agatha noted with a cynical twitch of her eyebrow that Sheila was careful not to ruin her makeup. "Murdered in cold blood in Carsely." "We don't know it's murder yet, Sheila," Bill Wong said, his voice calm but authoritative, as he signalled the piper to stop the agonizingly slow drone of the pipes. He turned to the stunned crowd. "I must ask everyone to stay exactly where they are. No one leaves the hall until we've taken statements." A collective groan rippled through the room. For the residents of Carsely, a death was a tragedy, but being held captive in a draughty hall with nothing but cold turnips and a dead land developer was an inconvenience of the highest order. Agatha, however, felt a familiar electric tingle in her veins. The humiliation of the green silk dress was already fading, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus that usually heralded a new case. She watched Bill carefully cover the body with a heavy tablecloth, but not before she caught another glimpse of that flask. "Bill," Agatha hissed, sidling up to him while he tried to coordinate with a local constable. "The flask. He poured something on the haggis right before he took a bite. Did you see it?" "I saw it, Agatha," Bill replied tiredly, "and I see that look in your eyes. Please, for once, just go home when I tell you to. This is a police matter. It could be a heart attack." The man was practically vibrating with high blood pressure and whisky. "He turned blue, Bill. People don't turn blue from a simple heart attack after pouring mystery liquid on their lunch," Agatha retorted, her voice rising. "It was theatrical. It was deliberate." As Bill was pulled away by the squire, Agatha turned her attention to the room. The village buzz had begun in earnest. Groups were huddling, their heads bobbing like pigeons in a park. She caught sight of Mrs. Bloxby, who was currently comforting a trembling catering assistant. Agatha made a beeline for her. "Terrible business, isn't it?" Agatha whispered, her eyes darting around, "though I suppose Sheila will enjoy being the centre of a tragedy for the next 6 months." "Agatha, really?" Mrs. Bloxby reproached gently, though her eyes remained troubled. "A man has died. Poor Alistair, he was quite a force of nature." "He was a bully," Agatha corrected. "Bill says he was rude to the staff." "Which staff exactly?" Mrs. Bloxby sighed, indicating the young girl who had been the target of Munro's earlier laughter. "Young Sarah. She's only 16, and he quite reduced her to tears over the temperature of the soup." And then there was the tension with the planning committee. You know, Alistair wasn't just here for the supper. He was looking at the old mill site. He wanted to turn it into a luxury wellness retreat for Londoners. Agatha's ears pricked up. The old mill was a sore spot in Carsely. Half the village wanted the investment, and the other half, led by the more traditionalist element, wanted it left to rot in peace. And who was most against the mill project? Well, James Lacey was quite vocal at the last parish meeting, Mrs. Bloxby admitted reluctantly. Agatha felt a cold lump in her stomach. James, of course. Her handsome, stubborn neighbour was always tilting at windmills, or in this case, preventing them from becoming spas. She looked across the room and saw James standing by the window, his arms crossed over his kilt, looking more like a brooding Highland chieftain than ever. He looked troubled, almost guilty. Agatha shook the thought away. James wouldn't kill anyone, he didn't have the temperament for it. He preferred writing dry historical tomes to actual violence. But as she scanned the room, she saw others whose reactions were equally interesting. Mr. Higgins, the butcher, was staring at his ceremonial knife with a look of pure horror, his hands shaking so violently that his wife had to take the blade from him. Sheila's real Scot cousin had brought a lot of baggage to this small village, it seemed. Agatha, a voice rumbled behind her. It was James. He had approached her with a sombre expression. "This is a grim business, to think I was just speaking to him about the Highland clearances an hour ago." He was remarkably ill-informed. "Is that a motive for murder in your book, James? Historical inaccuracy?" Agatha asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the fluttering in her heart. James didn't smile. He was a man who made enemies as easily as he breathed. He told me tonight that he'd already secured the contracts for the mill, regardless of what the village thought. He claimed he had someone on the inside helping him. "On the inside?" Agatha repeated. She looked back at the head table where Sheila was now being tended to by the village doctor. Sheila, the woman who claimed to be a direct relative. Sheila, whose husband was on the planning committee. Suddenly the local constable, a stout man named Miller, who had never liked Agatha's London ways, clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Right then, Mrs. Raisin. I saw you hovering near the body. Why don't we start with your statement, and try to keep the conspiracy theories to a minimum?" Agatha squared her shoulders, her chin tilted at a defiant angle. "Conspiracy theories, Miller? I am merely observing. For instance, I observed that the guest of honour died exactly 3 minutes after seasoning his own dinner with a flask no one else touched. If you'd like me to explain the basic principles of cause and effect, I'd be happy to, though I suspect it might take all night." As Miller led her toward a small side room for questioning, Agatha glanced back at the table. The flask was gone, she was certain of it. It had been resting near the edge of the tablecloth, and now there was nothing but a faint oily ring on the wood. Someone had moved it while Bill was distracted. Someone in this room was very clever, very quick, and currently pretending to be very shocked. Agatha's irritation at the spoiled evening was replaced by a grim determination. She was going to find out who had turned the Burns night supper into a crime scene, if only to prove to James that she was more than just a woman in a daring green dress. The interrogation by Constable Miller was as tedious as a rainy Sunday in a bus shelter. He seemed more interested in Agatha's exact arrival time, and whether she had seen any suspicious foreigners than the glaringly obvious disappearance of the flask. By the time Agatha was released into the chilly night air, her green silk dress felt like a layer of ice against her skin, and her temper was at a rolling boil. The village hall was still being guarded, but the residents were finally being allowed to trickle home, looking like a defeated army retreating from a particularly disastrous skirmish.
Agatha didn't go straight to her car. Instead, she lurked in the shadows of a large yew tree near the hall's side exit. Her eyes narrowed.
She knew the rhythm of Carsely. The official investigation would be slow, hampered by paperwork and Miller's lack of imagination. If that flask had been whisked away, it hadn't gone far. "Looking for something, Agatha, or just waiting to pounce on a passing suspect?" James Lacey's voice made her jump, nearly twisting her ankle in her sensible yet stylish heels. He was walking toward the car park, his kilt swaying with a grace that Agatha found deeply distracting. "The flask is gone, James," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "I saw it on the table, and then, after Bill covered the body, it vanished. Someone took it while everyone was playing the part of the grieving villager." James stopped, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure? It's a chaotic scene in there. It might have been knocked onto the floor or gathered up with the linens by the catering staff." "It was an oily ring, James. An oily ring doesn't just walk away," Agatha snapped, her breath hitching in the cold. And Sheila Cartwright's grief is about as genuine as a £3 note. Did you see the way she was checking her reflection in the silver punch bowl while crying? Sheila is high-strung, James offered cautiously, but Alistair was her cousin. Why would she want him dead? He was the golden goose for her social standing. Having a millionaire land developer in the family was her favourite topic of conversation. Unless the golden goose was about to stop laying, Agatha countered. She began walking toward the road, forcing James to keep pace with her. Mrs. Bloxby said he was rude to the staff and that he had someone on the inside regarding the mill project. If Sheila or her husband Percy were involved in some shady deal that Alistair was about to blow the whistle on, or if he was cutting them out, they'd have plenty of reason to ensure he didn't make it to the dessert course. They reached the edge of the car park just as a silver Mercedes purred past them. Behind the wheel was Percy Cartwright, Sheila's husband, looking remarkably grim. Sheila was in the passenger seat, her head leaned back against the headrest, no longer sobbing. In fact, she looked as though she were giving Percy a very stern lecture. "Look at them," Agatha whispered. "That's not the posture of a bereaved woman. That's the posture of a woman who's just finished a very difficult job. You're jumping to conclusions again, Agatha." James sighed, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "I'm going home. I suggest you do the same. You look exhausted, and that dress is... well, it's seen better days." Agatha watched him walk away, a mixture of longing and irritation rising in her chest. Exhausted? Seen better days? She was a PR powerhouse, a woman who had handled London's most temperamental celebrities, and she wasn't about to be dismissed by a man in a skirt. Instead of heading to her cottage, Agatha took a detour. She knew that Sarah, the young catering assistant Munro had bullied, lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village with her grandmother. If the flask had been cleared away with the dishes, Sarah would be the one to know. It was late, and it was technically interfering with a police investigation, but Agatha had never let such trivialities stop her before. The village was eerily quiet, the smell of wood smoke hanging heavy in the air. As she approached Sarah's cottage, she saw a light flickering in the kitchen window. She knocked firmly, ignoring the way her heart hammered against her ribs. The door opened a crack, and Sarah's pale, tear-streaked face appeared. "Mrs. Raisin?" the girl sniffled. "It's ever so late. I know, dear, and I'm terribly sorry," Agatha said, her voice dropping into a practised maternal tone she rarely used but kept in her arsenal for just such occasions. "But it's about tonight. It was such a shock. I was worried about you. That man was so cruel to you. I wanted to make sure you were all right." The girl's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He was horrible. He said I was village refuse because I spilled a drop of scotch, but I didn't mean any harm, I swear." "Of course you didn't," Agatha said, stepping inside before she was invited. The kitchen was small and cluttered. On the counter sat a plastic bin filled with the discarded remnants of the head table's place settings. "Did you clear the head table, Sarah? After the incident?" "The police told us to leave most of it," Sarah whispered. "But the squire told me to tidy up the clutter, so it wouldn't look so grisly for the ladies. I just grabbed the loose bits." Agatha's eyes locked onto the bin. Nestled between a crumpled napkin and a half-eaten oatcake was a small silver flask. "That's it," Agatha breathed, reaching for it. "Oh, don't touch that, Mrs. Raisin," Sarah cried, shrinking back. "I was going to wash it, but then I smelled it. It made my head spin just catching a whiff. It doesn't smell like whiskey at all. It smells like old bitter almonds." Agatha froze, her hand inches from the silver. Cyanide. The classic dramatic and utterly lethal choice. But as she leaned closer, she realized Sarah was wrong. It wasn't just almonds. There was something else. A cloyingly sweet chemical undertone that reminded Agatha of the heavy-duty industrial cleaners used in London office blocks. Before she could say another word, a heavy shadow fell across the kitchen window, and the sound of footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Someone was coming for the flask, and Agatha Raisin was trapped in a kitchen with a terrified teenager and a container of poison. Agatha's heart did a frantic somersault against her ribs. Instinct, sharpened by years of navigating the cutthroat boardrooms of London and the equally treacherous tea parties of the Cotswolds, took over. She didn't stop to think about forensics or police procedure. She only thought about the fact that someone was coming for the evidence. She grabbed a linen napkin from the bin, scooped up the silver flask with a grimace, praying the bitter almond scent wouldn't seep into the leather lining of her vintage handbag, and shoved it deep between her Chanel lipstick and a crumpled receipt for a box of luxury chocolates. "Into the pantry, Sarah, now!" Agatha hissed, shoving the bewildered girl toward a small door under the stairs just as the kitchen door handle began to turn. Agatha didn't join her. She couldn't. Running would look guilty, and Agatha Raisin didn't do guilty unless she had accidentally insulted a powerful fashion editor. She stood by the counter, smoothed her rumpled green silk, and assumed her most formidable professional in crisis expression. The door creaked open, admitting a gust of freezing night air and the silhouette of a man. It wasn't a shadowy assassin, but Percy Cartwright. He looked remarkably different from the polished, subservient husband Agatha usually saw at church. His tie was loosened, his face was a mottled red, and his eyes darted around the kitchen with a desperate, frantic energy. He stopped dead when he saw Agatha standing there, her arms crossed, looking for all the world like she owned the place. "Agatha?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "What on earth are you doing here? This is Sarah's home. It's nearly midnight." "I could ask you the same thing, Percy," Agatha said, her voice dripping with a chilly, upper-crust disdain, "though I imagine you're here on behalf of Sheila. She's probably realized she left her dignity back at the village hall and sent you to find it." Percy flinched, but his gaze immediately slid to the bin Sarah had been clearing. I was told Alistair's personal effects might have been gathered up by the catering staff. A family memento." "Sheila is distraught, Agatha. She wants his flask back. It's an heirloom." "An heirloom?" Agatha raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. "Odd. I didn't know the Munros were in the habit of passing down silver flasks that smell like a chemical spill at a pesticide factory. And surely the police would consider personal effects to be evidence in a sudden death, wouldn't they?" Percy took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Don't be difficult, Agatha. It's a tragedy, not a detective novel. Give it to me if you found it. It will only cause more trouble for that poor girl, Sarah." "I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about," Agatha lied, her face a mask of bored indifference. "I came here to check on the girl because she was bullied by your distraught cousin-in-law. I haven't seen any flask. Perhaps it's under the table in the hall, being trampled by the police." Percy stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage and the sharp metallic tang of his sweat. For a second Agatha thought he might actually lunge at her, and she tightened her grip on her heavy handbag, ready to use it as a blunt force weapon. Then he let out a jagged breath and turned on his heel. "Stay out of this, Agatha," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't one of your little village games. There are things happening in this valley that you don't understand, big things." He slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small kitchen. Agatha waited until the sound of his car faded into the distance before she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sarah peered out from the pantry, her face as white as a sheet. "Is he gone?" the girl whispered. "He's gone," Agatha said, though her mind was already racing. Big things. It was always big things with men like Percy. Usually it meant money, and in the Cotswolds big money meant land. She reached into her bag and pulled out the flask, the silver feeling unnaturally cold against her palm. That chemical smell, it wasn't just poison. It was familiar.
She smelled it recently, not in a kitchen, but outdoors. She bid a hurried, somewhat distracted farewell to Sarah, promising to tell Bill Wong the girl was entirely innocent, and marched back toward her own cottage.
The moon was high now, casting long skeletal shadows across the road. As she passed the turn-off for the old mill site, she stopped. The wind shifted, and there it was again, that cloyingly sweet synthetic odour. Agatha's eyes narrowed. The mill site was supposed to be a wellness retreat full of organic lavender and overpriced yoga mats. So why did the ground smell like industrial-grade weed-killer? And why had Alistair Munro been carrying a flask filled with the same toxic brew? She needed to speak to James. Or Bill. But as she reached her front gate, she saw a dark shape sitting on her porch. It wasn't James, and it certainly wasn't the police. It was a large, sodden cardboard box, and pinned to the top was a note in elegant, chillingly familiar handwriting. Agatha, curiosity is a very aging trait. Do be careful. Agatha felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. She was no longer just a nosy neighbour, she was a target. And if there was one thing Agatha Raisin hated more than being targeted, it was being told she looked old. Agatha carried the box into her kitchen with the gingerly care one might afford a ticking bomb. She set it on the scrubbed pine table, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, she told herself, but from the sheer audacity of the insult. Curiosity is an aging trait. The words burned in her mind more than the threat of the box itself. She reached for a serrated bread knife and sliced through the packing tape with a viciousness that felt remarkably cathartic. As the flaps sprang open, a waft of that cloying, chemical sweetness hit her, so thick it felt like a physical weight in the small room. Inside, nestled on a bed of damp, blackened straw, were a dozen roses. They weren't just dead, they had been systematically charred by some kind of caustic agent, their petals curled into brittle obsidian husks that crumbled at the slightest touch. It was a horticultural massacre. Agatha stared at them, her mind flashing back to the wellness retreat plans Alistair Munro had boasted about. This wasn't just a warning, it was a signature. Someone was using the very tools of the trade, herbicides and soil treatments, as weapons of terror. She barely slept that night. Every creak of the cottage's floorboard sounded like Percy Cartwright's heavy tread, and every rustle of the wind felt like a whisper about her age. She spent an hour in front of her vanity mirror, applying a thick layer of eternal youth night cream and wondering if the skin around her eyes really was sagging, or if the note was just a masterful piece of psychological warfare. By dawn, she had reached a decision. If the poison in the flask and the destruction of the roses came from the same source, she needed to find where such things were bought in bulk. The Cotswold Greenery was the largest garden centre in the district, a sprawling complex of glass houses and tea rooms that served as the unofficial headquarters for the village's obsessive gardeners. It was also where Percy Cartwright served as a consultant for large-scale landscaping projects. Agatha arrived just as the gates opened, her face a mask of determined elegance in a charcoal wool suit and heels that were entirely inappropriate for gravel paths. "Morning, Mrs. Raisin," called out Fred Rice, the owner, a man whose skin looked like weathered teak and who always smelled faintly of manure. "Early bird catches the worm, eh? Or are you here for the winter pansy sale? I'm looking for something a bit more—" "Potent, Fred," Agatha said, leaning over the counter and flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've had a terrible infestation at the cottage. Something that requires a professional-grade herbicide. Something that smells a bit like almonds, perhaps." Fred's brow furrowed. "Almonds? That sounds like the old-school stuff. Most of that's restricted now, Agatha. You need a license for the high-concentration paraquats and the like, though, funnily enough, I've had a run on the heavy-duty stuff lately." Agatha's heart skipped. "A run? In the middle of January? Landscapers," Fred shrugged, nodding toward a ledger. "The mill project, for one. They've been clearing the scrub, and Sheila Cartwright's been in too. Said she wanted to completely revitalize her back border. Bought enough weed killer to turn the Sahara into a parking lot." "Sheila?" Agatha repeated, her mind whirring. "But surely Percy provides her with all the supplies he uses for his consultancy?" "You'd think so." Fred lowered his voice, leaning in. "But between you and me, Percy's been a bit short on cash lately. Some bad investments, I heard. He's been buying on credit and not just here. He's been seen huddling with that Munro fellow more than once, and they didn't look like they were discussing roses, looked more like they were discussing a funeral." Agatha felt a surge of triumph. The inside man was Percy, but he wasn't just a partner, he was a debtor, and if Alistair Munro had discovered that Percy was cutting corners, or worse, that the land at the mill was contaminated, perhaps by the very chemicals Percy was supposed to be managing, the wellness retreat would have become a legal nightmare. She turned to leave, her mind already forming a plan to confront Sheila, when she nearly collided with a woman in a barber jacket who was examining a display of decorative pots. It was Sheila Cartwright herself, looking remarkably composed for a woman whose cousin had just dropped dead in a plate of turnips. "Agatha," Sheila chirped, her voice as sharp as a pruning shear. "Fancy seeing you here. I should have thought you'd be at home, perhaps resting. You looked so strained last night. It must be the excitement. It really does take a toll on a woman of your experience." Agatha felt the heat rise in her neck. "I'm perfectly fine, Sheila. In fact, I've never felt more energetic. I was just discussing the mill project with Fred. It's such a shame about Alistair. I imagine his death will put a real damper on Percy's consultancy fees, won't it?" The colour drained from Sheila's face, leaving her looking sallow and pinched. "I don't know what you're implying, Agatha, but I suggest you keep your nose out of things that don't concern you. Percy is a respected professional. Alistair's death was a tragic accident of the heart. Or a tragic accident of the flask," Agatha countered, her voice low and dangerous. "The one Percy was so desperate to find last night. Tell me, Sheila, does your husband always go house to house at midnight looking for heirlooms, or was he just worried about the smell of bitter almonds?" Sheila's hand tightened on her handbag so hard the knuckles turned white. For a moment the polite village mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of something cold, calculating and desperate. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think this is all a game. But some secrets are buried for a reason, Agatha, and people who dig them up often find themselves in a hole they can't climb out of." She turned and marched away, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. Agatha watched her go, a sense of mounting dread mingling with her excitement. She had provoked the snake, but she hadn't yet found the nest, and as she looked down she noticed a small, oily smudge on the sleeve of Sheila's jacket, the exact same iridescent sheen she had seen on the table next to Alistair Munro's head. Agatha watched Sheila's Mercedes pull away, with a spray of gravel that felt like a personal insult to her charcoal wool suit. Her mind was whirring like a high-speed blender. The iridescent smudge on Sheila's sleeve was the missing link, a physical bridge between the poisoned haggis and the Cartwright household. But Agatha knew that in a village like Carsely, a smudge wasn't enough to call in the cavalry. She needed something more substantial, something that smelled less like industrial weed-killer and more like cold, hard cash. She climbed into her own car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She didn't head home. Instead, she drove to a small lay-by 1/2 mile down the road, pulled over, and fished her mobile phone out of her handbag. It was time to call in a favour from her old life. "Roy, it's Agatha," she said the moment the line clicked open. "Agatha, darling." Roy Silver's voice was a frantic staccato of London energy, a sharp contrast to the slow, heavy atmosphere of the Cotswolds. "I was just thinking of you. I saw a picture of a very dowdy woman in a green dress on a local news site and thought, surely that can't be my Agatha. Tell me you've been framed." "It was the lighting, Roy, and don't you dare mention it again," Agatha snapped, though a small part of her was comforted by his familiar shallowness. "Listen, I need a background check. A man named Percy Cartwright. He's a landscaping consultant out here, but I suspect he's got fingers in some very muddy pies in London. Specifically anything to do with chemical disposal or industrial brownfield sites. Ooh, sounds gritty. Give me an hour, sweetness. I'll see what the financial ghouls have to say." Agatha hung up, feeling a momentary sense of power. While she waited, she drove back into the heart of Carsely. The village was in that peculiar state of suspended animation that follows a local scandal. People were out walking dogs and tending to hedges, but their movements were slow, their eyes constantly darting toward their neighbours' windows. She spotted James Lacey coming out of the post office, looking particularly dashing in a tweed jacket that made her heart do a treacherous little flutter. "Agatha, I thought you'd be lying down after last night," James said, falling into step beside her as she exited her car. "You look determined. That usually means trouble for someone." "It usually means justice, James, though I understand why you might confuse the two," Agatha retorted, smoothing her hair. "I've just had a very enlightening chat with Sheila Cartwright at the garden centre. Did you know she's been buying enough herbicide to clear the Amazon? And Percy is apparently short on cash. It seems our inside man was a man with a very large mortgage and a very dead cousin-in-law." James sighed, his expression softening into that patronising concern that Agatha found both infuriating and strangely endearing. "Agatha, be careful. If Percy is truly in financial trouble, he's a desperate man, and desperate men don't just write nasty notes about your age, they take steps to protect themselves. He already took a step, James. He came to Sarah's cottage last night looking for the flask. He knows I'm on to him. The flask? James stopped, his eyes widening. You have the flask? Agatha, you must take it to Bill Wong immediately it's evidence and let Bill take all the credit while Miller sneers at me. Certainly not, Agatha said, though she felt a twinge of guilt. I need to know why Alistair was killed. It wasn't just a simple disagreement over a wellness retreat. There's something buried at that mill, James. Literally. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text from Roy. Percy Cartwright, silent partner in Greenpath Solutions. Company went bust last year after a series of fines for illegal dumping of industrial toxins. Owed millions. Alistair Munro was the primary investor who pulled the plug. Agatha showed the screen to James. You see? Alistair didn't just know Percy was a bad consultant. He knew Percy was a criminal. If the mill project went through, the soil testing would have revealed the toxins Percy had been hiding there for years. The wellness retreat would have been a crime scene before the first yoga mat was unrolled. So Percy kills him to stop the project, James mused, rubbing his chin. But Alistair's death would likely bring more scrutiny to his affairs, not less. Not if his heir, Sheila, inherited the land and the silence, Agatha pointed out. If Alistair died before he could go to the authorities, Percy and Sheila could have sold the land to a less scrupulous developer, cleared the debts, and lived happily ever after in their tartan sashes. Suddenly the sound of a heavy engine rumbled behind them. A large white van with Cartwright landscaping plastered on the side was idling at the end of the street. The driver was obscured by the glare on the windshield, but the vehicle didn't move. It sat there, a silent, predatory weight in the middle of the village. "Is that him?" James whispered. Agatha didn't answer. She felt the weight of the silver flask in her handbag, the metal pressing against her hip like a cold secret. She realized then that she hadn't just uncovered a motive, she had uncovered a conspiracy that likely involved more than just the Cartwrights. If Percy had been dumping toxins at the mill, he needed someone on the planning committee to look the other way. "James," Agatha said, her voice steady despite the prickle of fear at the base of her neck. "I think it's time we paid a visit to the vicarage. I need to talk to Mrs. Bloxby about the planning committee records, and I think we should walk. I have a feeling my car might have a tragic accident if I try to drive it right now." As they began to walk, the van puttered into gear, following them at a walking pace, its engine a low, menacing growl in the quiet afternoon. Agatha Raisin was being hunted in her own village, and for the first time in her life she realized that being observed was far more dangerous than being ignored. The walk to the church felt like an eternity through a landscape of frozen garden hedges and judgmental windows. The white van trailed them with a predatory patience, its engine a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in Agatha's very teeth. She clutched James's arm, partly for balance, and partly because the solid, tweed-clad reality of him was the only thing keeping her from sprinting toward the vicarage in a very undignified fashion. James looked back over his shoulder every few paces, his expression hardening. "He's not even trying to hide it anymore," James whispered. "It's a blatant intimidation tactic. If he tries anything, Agatha, you get behind me." Agatha, despite her genuine fear, felt a small spark of irritation. "Don't be so Victorian, James. If he tries anything, I'll hit him with this handbag. It's a genuine mulberry and weighs more than a small child. Besides, my heels are quite sharp. One good kick to the shins and he'll be reconsidering his career in landscaping." They ducked through the lich gate, into the churchyard, the ancient stone walls of St. Mary's offering a cold, hallowed sanctuary. The van didn't follow them onto the consecrated ground. It pulled up at the curb, the engine idling, a silent sentinel in the gathering gloom. Agatha didn't stop to admire the Norman architecture. She practically dragged James through the heavy oak doors and into the quiet, incense-scented interior. Inside, the air was still and smelled of floor wax and old hymnals. Mrs. Bloxby was near the altar, meticulously polishing a brass eagle lectern. She looked up as they approached, her kind eyes immediately registering the frantic energy radiating from Agatha. "Agatha, James, you both look as though you've seen a ghost," she said, setting down her polishing cloth. "Or perhaps Percy Cartwright's van? I saw it circling the square earlier." "It's been doing more than circling, Margaret," Agatha said, collapsing into a front pew and immediately regretting it as the cold stone bit through her silk dress. "He's been following us, and not because he wants to discuss my flower beds. We think he killed Alistair Munro, and we think he did it because Munro knew about some very nasty business at the old mill." Quickly, and with more than a few dramatic flourishes, Agatha laid out her discoveries: the flask, the toxic roses, the illegal dumping, and Roy Silver's financial digging. Mrs. Bloxby listened with a growing look of dismay, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "The planning committee," Mrs. Bloxby mused, her voice soft. "I remember the meetings. There was a great deal of pressure to approve the mill project. It wasn't just Percy advocating for it. There was a sense that the village needed this, that we were falling behind." "Who was on the committee, Margaret?" James asked, leaning against a pillar. "Besides Percy, who had the final say?" "The squire, of course," Mrs. Bloxby said, "and Sheila was the secretary. But the swing vote, the person who really pushed for the environmental assessment to be fast-tracked, was Alistair's own local representative, a man he'd known for years." Agatha felt a prickle of realization. "Who? Well, it was Dr. Henderson," Mrs. Bloxby replied. "He's lived here for decades. He's the one who vouched for the wellness aspect of the retreat. He said the soil and air were the purest in the county." Agatha stood up so abruptly her handbag swung into the pew with a loud clack. Dr. Henderson, the man who had been the first to examine Alistair's body, the man who had been tending to a distraught Sheila at the hall. "The doctor," Agatha breathed. "He wasn't just a committee member, he's the medical authority. If anyone could fake a death certificate or cover up the symptoms of poisoning, it's him. And if he's been in Percy's pocket, or perhaps even the one who suggested the dumping in the first place, he'd have everything to lose." "But why kill Munro?" James argued. "Munro was his friend. Munro was his investor," Agatha corrected, "and investors ask for audits. If Munro had started asking why the soil at the mill was killing the local wildlife before the project even started, Henderson's reputation and his medical license would be finished. He wouldn't just be a failed politician, he'd be a criminal." Suddenly the heavy door of the church creaked open. A shaft of grey light cut through the gloom, and a figure stepped inside. It wasn't Percy, it was Dr. Henderson, still in his overcoat, carrying a small medical bag. He looked weary, but his eyes were sharp as they locked onto Agatha. "Ah, Mrs. Raisin," he said, his voice smooth and professional, though there was a new cold edge to it. "I thought I might find you here. Constable Miller mentioned you were distressed. I've brought something to help you sleep, a mild sedative. You've had such a trying few days." He began walking down the aisle toward them, his footsteps echoing on the stone. Agatha instinctively moved closer to James, her hand sliding into her bag to grip the silver flask. "How kind of you, Doctor," Agatha said, her heart hammering. "But I'm wide awake. In fact, I've never been more alert. We were just discussing the planning committee. It's fascinating how pure the soil at the mill turned out to be, isn't it?" The doctor stopped. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "The soil is as it should be, Agatha, for those who know how to manage it. Now, why don't you give me that bag? It looks terribly heavy, and I'd hate for you to strain yourself." He took another step, and Agatha realized with a jolt of terror that the inside man wasn't just a business partner. He was the man who held the power of life and death in Carsely, and he was currently looking at her as though she were a particularly troublesome virus he was about to eradicate. Agatha felt the cold stone of the pew behind her legs as Dr. Henderson continued his slow, measured approach. The dim light of the church caught the metallic glint of his medical bag, which now felt less like a kit for healing and more like a collection of silent clinical weapons. James stepped forward, his body shielding Agatha's, but Henderson didn't flinch. He merely tilted his head, a gesture of professional pity that made Agatha's blood boil even through her fear. "James, move aside," Henderson said softly. "Agatha is clearly suffering from a manic episode. The stress of London life, followed by the isolation of the village, It's a recipe for a breakdown. I'm only here to help." "Help?" Agatha's voice cracked, but she quickly steadied it, summoning her most imperious PR tone. "Is that what you call what you did to Alistair? Helping?" "You weren't helping him when you watched him gargle on that toxic cocktail. And you certainly weren't helping when you whisked away the evidence." "Evidence?" Henderson laughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the rafters. "Agatha, you have a vivid imagination. I cleared the table to preserve the dignity of the deceased and the comfort of the living. It's called manners, something you seem to have forgotten in your quest for relevance." Agatha felt the silver flask in her bag. It was her only shield. She knew she couldn't outrun him in her heels, and James was too much of a gentleman to strike a doctor in a church without provocation. She needed a social gamble, a way to force Henderson to reveal the cracks in his polished veneer. "Manners," Agatha repeated, stepping around James so she was eye to eye with the doctor. "Is it good manners to let your friend die because he found out you were helping Percy Cartwright bury industrial poison under a planned wellness retreat? Or was it more about the fact that Alistair was going to name you as the one who signed off on the falsified soil reports?" Henderson's eyes flickered. For a split second the clinical calm vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. Alistair was a fool. He didn't understand the scale of the debt Percy had incurred. He was going to bankrupt half the village with his audit. I was protecting Carsely. "By poisoning the haggis?" James asked, his voice low with disgust. "I didn't poison the haggis," Henderson snapped, his grip tightening on his bag. "I merely provided the catalyst. Alistair was a man of ritual. He always used his own flask. He always insisted on seasoning the meat himself. All I did was ensure his flask was refilled with a more permanent vintage." "But the smell," Agatha said, her heart racing. Sarah noticed it. It smelled like almonds, but also like something else, something industrial. "A little something from Percy's private stock," Henderson said, taking another step. "Cyanide is efficient, but difficult to explain. A high-concentration pesticide, however, combined with a history of heart disease and a heavy meal, it looks like a natural if messy end. Now, Agatha, I really must insist on that bag. You're becoming a public health hazard." Mrs. Bloxby, who had been standing silent by the lectern, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight of authority that stopped the doctor in his tracks. "Doctor, I've already called Bill Wong. He's on his way. I took the liberty of using the vestry phone the moment I saw you enter the churchyard. I believe he's very interested in the planning records I've just found." The lie was masterful. Agatha knew there was no vestry phone. The vicarage was separate, but Henderson didn't. He spun around, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors. In that moment of distraction the door creaked open again. This time it wasn't the police. It was Sheila Cartwright, her face a mask of fury, followed by a very dishevelled Percy. "You coward!" Sheila screamed, her voice shrill and echoing. "You said it would be clean. You said no one would know. Now everyone is talking, and Agatha Raisin is running around with the evidence." The church, once a place of quiet contemplation, was now a theatre of the absurd. The doctor, the landscaper, the social climber, and the detective were all trapped in a standoff beneath the gaze of the stained-glass saints. "I'm not the one who let her see the flask, Sheila," Henderson hissed, turning his venom on her. "I told you to keep Percy under control. He's the one who went to the cottage and practically handed her the case on a silver platter." "I was trying to get it back," Percy roared, stepping toward Henderson. "You're the one who told me she had it." Agatha saw her opening. The three were turning on each other, the weight of their collective guilt finally snapping the fragile bonds of their conspiracy. She reached into her bag, pulled out the silver flask and held it high above her head like a trophy. "You want it?" she challenged, her voice ringing out. "Then come and get it. But remember, the police are minutes away, and I've already sent a photo of this to my contacts in London. If I go down, the story goes national. The poisoned parish, a doctor's greed in a village's grave, the mention of national press, Agatha's old weapon, hit them harder than any physical blow." Henderson froze. Sheila gasped. Percy looked as though he were about to be sick. "Agatha, give it to me," James said softly, reaching for the flask. "No, James," Agatha said, her eyes locked on Henderson. The doctor wants to help me sleep, remember? I think he should be the one to hold on to it. It belongs with his medical supplies, after all. Before Henderson could react, the sound of sirens finally cut through the afternoon air, real sirens this time. Bill Wong's patrol car swerved into the churchyard, the blue lights strobing against the ancient stone walls. The gamble had paid off. Agatha Raisin had not only found the murderer, but she had orchestrated a social collapse so complete that even Sheila Cartwright couldn't talk her way out of it. But, as the police burst through the doors, Agatha caught a final, lingering look on Henderson's face. It wasn't just defeat. It was a cold, calculating satisfaction. As Bill Wong stepped forward to take the flask, Henderson whispered something that only Agatha could hear. "You found the flask, Agatha, but did you ever wonder why there was more than one person at that table with a reason to see Alistair die?" Agatha's triumph faltered. She looked at Sheila, then at Percy, and then back at the doctor. The investigation wasn't over. The second revelation, the one that would truly shake Carsely, was still waiting in the wings of the Burns night feast. The arrival of Bill Wong, and a swarm of high-visibility jackets, brought an end to the standoff, but it didn't bring peace to Agatha's mind. As Henderson was led away, his clinical dignity finally crumbling into a frantic consultation with his solicitor over a mobile phone, and the Cartwrights were separated for questioning, Agatha stood in the centre of the nave feeling a strange hollow chill. Henderson's parting whisper echoed in her ears like a persistent moth fluttering against a window pane. More than one person. She watched Bill carefully bag the silver flask, but her eyes kept drifting back to the vestry door where the planning committee records sat in a disorganized heap. "You did it, Agatha," James said, coming to stand beside her. He looked weary, his kilt slightly askew, but there was a genuine note of admiration in his voice that usually would have sent Agatha into a state of purring delight. "You caught him, the doctor of all people. It'll be the talk of the Cotswolds for a decade." "It's too neat, James," Agatha muttered, her eyes narrowing as she watched Sheila Cartwright being ushered into a police car. Sheila wasn't fighting. She was staring straight ahead with a look of terrifying, icy calculation. Henderson provided the poison, yes, and Percy provided the chemicals. But did you see Sheila's face when the sirens started? She wasn't surprised. She was relieved. Relieved to be caught? James asked skeptically. "Agatha, your imagination is working overtime. Go home, have a gin and tonic, and let the professionals handle the paperwork." Agatha didn't have a gin and tonic. Instead, she waited until James had departed, and Bill was occupied with a forensic team. Then she slipped back toward the vestry. Mrs. Bloxby was still there, tidying the scattered papers with her usual quiet efficiency. "Margaret," Agatha said, her voice low. "Henderson said something about Alistair's audit bankrupting half the village. He said he was protecting Carsely. But Sheila isn't a protector, she's a predator. If Alistair died, she inherited. But what did she inherit besides the land?" Mrs. Bloxby paused, a single sheet of paper in her hand. "She inherited the silence, Agatha, but she also inherited Alistair's personal journals. He was a meticulous man. He kept records of every meeting, every bribe, every indiscretion." "Where are they?" Agatha demanded. "The police searched the manor, but they didn't find them," Mrs. Bloxby whispered. "But Sheila was at the hall early on Burns night. She was helping with the decorations. She spent a lot of time in the small cloakroom near the kitchen." Agatha didn't wait for another word. She took a gamble, driving her car at a speed that would have made Constable Miller's moustache curl, back toward the now darkened village hall. The yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, but the guard had been reduced to a single bored officer at the front door. Agatha, knowing the hall like the back of her hand from a dozen failed charity committees, slipped through the coal cellar hatch, a manoeuvre that played havoc with her silk dress but got her inside. The hall was ghostly, the smell of haggis and floor wax still lingering in the cold air. She made her way to the cloakroom, her penlight cutting a narrow swath through the darkness. She searched the coat racks, the boot boxes, and the umbrella stands. Nothing. Then she noticed a loose floorboard beneath a stack of folded bridge tables. She pried it up, her heart thumping. Tucked inside was a leather-bound diary and a second flask, identical to the silver one Bill had taken, but this one was made of cheap, polished pewter. Agatha opened the diary. The last entry was dated the morning of the Burns night supper. S knows about the offshore accounts. P is a liability. But the doctor, he's the one who suggested the final solution for the audit. They think I'm the one in danger. They don't realize I've already changed the will. If I die tonight, the mill land goes to the National Trust. No retreat, no profit, no cover-up. Let them rot in their own toxins. Agatha let out a long, low whistle. Alistair Munro hadn't been a helpless victim. He had been a spiteful old man who had set a trap for his own killers. But as she reached for the pewter flask, she smelled it. Not almonds, not chemicals. It smelled of nothing at all. She unscrewed the cap and tipped a drop onto her finger. It was water, pure, simple water. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Henderson had poisoned the silver flask, thinking Alistair would use it. But Alistair, suspicious and cunning, had switched them. He had been drinking water all night. So why was he dead? Agatha stood up, her mind racing back to the moment of the death. Munro had taken a mouthful of the haggis after pouring the liquid from the flask over it. But the flask he used was the silver one, the poisoned one. He had switched them back? No, he wouldn't. She looked at the haggis dish, still sitting on the head table in the main hall, now a dried, grey mass under a plastic forensic dome. And then she saw it, a small discarded wrapper from a brand of high-strength, sugar-free throat lozenges that Alistair was known to suck on incessantly for his smoker's cough. The lozenges. They contained a specific sweetener that, when mixed with the particular pesticide Henderson had used, didn't just cause a heart attack. It caused a violent, instantaneous respiratory collapse. But Henderson wouldn't have known about the lozenges. Only someone who lived with him, someone who managed his daily routine, someone who knew his medical quirks perfectly. Agatha turned, her penlight catching a pair of eyes watching her from the shadows of the stage curtain. It wasn't the doctor. It wasn't Percy. "You were always too nosy for your own good, Agatha," said a voice, sharp and cold as a winter frost. Sheila Cartwright stepped into the light, holding a heavy brass trophy from the village flower show. The doctor provided the means, and Percy provided the opportunity, but neither of them had the stomach to actually finish it. They thought the flask would do the job. I just had to make sure the seasoning was inevitable. Agatha backed away, her heels catching on the loose floorboard. "You switched the flasks back, didn't you? You saw him put the water flask on the table, and you swapped it for the poison while he was talking to the squire. And I made sure he had a fresh lozenge right before the pipe started," Sheila said, stepping closer, the brass trophy raised. "It's a shame, really. You could have just stayed home and complained about your age. Now I'm afraid you're going to be the second tragedy of the Burns night secret." Agatha's heels skidded on the polished floorboards, her mind flashing through a dozen PR strategies for surviving a blunt force trauma assault by a social rival. None of them seemed particularly helpful. Sheila Cartwright advanced, the brass trophy glinting with a lethal golden light in the beam of Agatha's penlight. The transformation was total. The fluttery, tartan-clad churchwarden had vanished, replaced by a woman whose ambition had finally curdled into something murderous. "You really shouldn't have come back, Agatha," Sheila hissed, her voice echoing in the hollow silence of the hall. Everything was falling into place. The doctor would take the fall for the poisoning. It's so plausible, isn't it? The greedy physician and the disgraced landscaper. I was the grieving relative, the one left to clean up the mess and reluctantly sell the land to pay off Alistair's debts. We would have been clear. "Clear of what, Sheila? The smell of toxins," Agatha retorted, her back hitting the cold, hard surface of the catering hatch. "You were going to kill half the village with that wellness retreat just to keep your house and your bridge club memberships. Alistair was right, you're a predator. I am a survivor." Sheila shrieked, swinging the trophy. Agatha ducked, the heavy brass whistling past her ear and smashing into the wooden hatch with a splintering crack. The vibration shuddered through the floor. Agatha didn't wait for a second swing. She lunged forward, not away, and swung her mulberry handbag with every ounce of frustration she'd accumulated over the last 48 hours. The bag, weighted with a silver flask, several heavy cosmetics, and a very thick diary, caught Sheila squarely in the midriff. Sheila let out a sharp oomph and stumbled back, dropping the trophy. Agatha didn't stop. She scrambled toward the main doors, but Sheila was surprisingly fast for a woman in sensible court shoes. She tackled Agatha from behind, and the two women went down in a chaotic heap of Lincoln green silk and Barber wool. They tumbled across the floor of the hall, near the head table where Alistair had taken his final gargling breath. "Bill! Miller! Help!" Agatha screamed, her voice muffled by the dusty floorboards. "They can't hear you, Agatha," Sheila gasped, her hands reaching for Agatha's throat. "The wind is too high, and the station is 10 miles away." Agatha felt Sheila's fingers tighten. Her vision began to blur, the red and green plaid decorations around the room spinning into a sickening whirl. Her hand clawed at the floor, searching for anything to use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around something small and hard. A discarded ceremonial glass from the Burns night toast that hadn't been cleared away. With a desperate, ungraceful heave, Agatha smashed the glass against the leg of the table. The sharp crack startled Sheila, her grip loosening for just a second. Agatha drove her elbow into Sheila's ribs and rolled away, gasping for air. She stood up, swaying, her hair a wild, tangled mess, her designer dress torn at the shoulder. "It's over, Sheila," Agatha wheezed, holding the jagged base of the glass like a dagger. "I have the diary, I have the second flask, and most importantly, I have a witness." Sheila sneered, wiping a smudge of floor wax from her cheek. "Who? The mice?" "No," a deep voice boomed from the darkness of the entrance. "Me." The hall lights flickered on, blinding them both. Standing by the switch was James Lacey, looking uncharacteristically dishevelled, with Bill Wong right behind him. James was holding a heavy iron poker he'd grabbed from the foyer fireplace, and his face was set in a look of grim, soldierly fury. "Agatha didn't come home, Bill," James said, his eyes never leaving Sheila. "I told you she was too stubborn to stay out of it. We saw her car outside, and the cellar hatch open." Bill Wong stepped forward, his handcuffs clicking with a sound that, to Agatha, was more beautiful than any Scottish symphony. "Sheila Cartwright, I'm arresting you for the murder of Alistair Munro and the attempted murder of Agatha Raisin." As the police led a now silent, shivering Sheila away, the adrenaline began to drain from Agatha's system, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She slumped into the chair Alistair had occupied, staring at the ruin of her evening and her outfit. "You look terrible, Agatha," James said, though he sat down next to her and draped his tweed jacket over her shivering shoulders. "Thank you, James." "Your talent for compliments remains unparalleled," Agatha sighed, leaning her head back. "But I was right. It wasn't just the doctor. It was the social politics. Sheila couldn't bear to be poor again. She'd rather be a murderer than a woman who buys her clothes at a supermarket." "And you?" James asked softly. "What would you rather be?" Agatha looked down at her torn green silk. She thought of the aging trait note, the toxic roses and the terrifying strength in Sheila's hands. Then she thought of the weight of the diary in her bag, the truth that would save the village from the poison buried at the mill. "I'd rather be right, James," she said, a small, weary smile touching her lips as she adjusted his jacket. "And I'd rather be the woman who solved the Burns night secret while wearing a dress that was, despite everything, very daring." The aftermath in Carsely was, as predicted, a storm of gossip that lasted well into the spring. Dr.
Henderson lost his license and faced a lengthy prison sentence for his role in the conspiracy.
Percy Cartwright turned King's evidence against his wife to save his own skin, and the old mill site was eventually bought by the National Trust, destined to become a nature reserve rather than a wellness retreat. Agatha Raisin returned to her cottage, bought a new, even more expensive dress in a shade of midnight blue, and waited for James Lacey to invite her over for a celebratory drink. He didn't, of course, but as she sat by her fire with a glass of malt whisky, sipped from a very plain, non-silver glass, she decided that being the brilliant, blunt, and slightly battered detective of Carsely was, in its own way, the most successful PR campaign she'd ever run. The morning light that filtered through the leaded windows of Agatha's cottage was merciless, highlighting the bruises on her neck and the irreparable state of her Lincoln green silk dress, which lay in a dejected heap on the bedroom floor. Agatha groaned, reaching for a bottle of extra-strength ibuprofen and a cooling eye gel. Her reflection in the vanity mirror was a testament to her victory. She looked like she'd gone 10 rounds with a heavy-duty hedge trimmer. But her eyes, sharp and observant as ever, carried the unmistakable glint of a woman who had been proven right. By 10 o'clock, the village of Carsely was practically vibrating. The news of Dr. Henderson's arrest and Sheila Cartwright's murderous desperation had spread faster than a rumour about a sale at Harrods. Agatha had barely finished her first cup of scalding black coffee when there was a gentle knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bloxby, carrying a tin of homemade shortbread and a look of profound relief. "Agatha, dear," the vicar's wife said, stepping into the kitchen and immediately putting the kettle on. "The whole village is in a state of shock. To think that Dr. Henderson—" And poor Sheila. It's quite shaken everyone's faith in the local hierarchy. Faith is all well and good, Margaret, but a bit of common sense wouldn't go amiss in this parish, Agatha said, wincing as she sat down. They were all so blinded by the promise of wellness and status that they didn't stop to wonder why the guest of honour was turning blue in the turnips. If it weren't for my ageing curiosity, they'd be doing yoga on a bed of industrial toxins by next Christmas. Mrs. Bloxby patted Agatha's hand. "We are all very grateful, even if some people find it difficult to say so. The squire is particularly embarrassed, having vouched for Alistair Munro so publicly. He's already talking about a commemorative plaque for the new nature reserve, perhaps something acknowledging your role?" Agatha perked up instantly. A plaque? In bronze? Or would that look too much like a gravestone? Perhaps a nice bench with a view of the mill stream. The Agatha Raisin memorial bench for those who actually notice things. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. It was Bill Wong, looking as though he hadn't slept a wink. He stepped into the kitchen, clutching a folder of statements. "Agatha, I've just come from the station. Sheila is singing like a canary, mostly blaming the doctor and Percy, but the evidence of the switched flasks is undeniable. We found the second flask in the cloakroom exactly where you said it would be." "And the diary, Bill? Did you read about the will?" "We did," Bill nodded. Munro knew they were coming for him. He'd left instructions with his London solicitors. "The land is protected now. But I have to ask, Agatha, why did you go back to the hall alone? You could have been killed." "I had to be sure, Bill," Agatha said, her voice softening for a moment. "It's one thing to have a theory. It's another to see the look in someone's eyes when they realize their social ladder has just turned into a gallows. Besides, someone had to rescue that diary before the police misplaced it." Bill smiled ruefully. "I suppose I should thank you. Officially, you're a menace to procedure. Unofficially, you've saved me 3 months of paperwork and probably a dozen lives. Just try to stay out of trouble for at least a week, will you?" After Bill left, Agatha watched from her window as the white Cartwright landscaping van was towed away from the village square, a physical manifestation of the family's fall from grace. She felt a brief, uncharacteristic pang of pity for Percy, who was likely currently discovering that his wife's ambition was far more dangerous than his own incompetence. The afternoon brought one final visitor, James Lacey appeared at her gate, looking stiff and slightly awkward. He didn't come inside, but he stood on the path, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm going back to my history book, Agatha," he announced, as if declaring a change in foreign policy. "All this drama is quite exhausting. But, if you're up to it, there's a new exhibition of Highland landscapes in Merster tomorrow. I thought we might go. As a reward for your tenacity." Agatha felt her heart do a traitorous little skip. Tenacity? Is that what we're calling it now, James? "It's a more polite word for nosiness, Agatha," he said, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his serious expression. "I'll pick you up at 10. As his gate clicked shut, Agatha turned back to her kitchen, the silence of the cottage no longer feeling like loneliness, but like a hard-won peace. She caught sight of herself in the hall mirror once more. The bruises were still there, and she'd need a very expensive trip to the hairdresser to fix the damage Sheila had done, but she stood tall. She had untangled the Burns night secret, saved the village from a toxic future, and secured a date with the most stubborn man in the Cotswolds. Not bad for a woman of a certain age, she whispered to herself, before heading to the cupboard to find the most expensive bottle of gin she owned. Not bad at all. The next morning, Agatha stood before her bathroom mirror, meticulously applying a thick layer of concealer over the faint yellowing of the bruise on her neck. It was the day of her excursion to Merster with James, and she was determined to look less like a victim of a village brawl and more like a sophisticated woman of leisure who just happened to dabble in high-stakes criminology. She chose a midnight blue wool suit with a silk pussy bow blouse, a look that whispered London executive while shouting, "I am far too chic for this rural nonsense." When James's silver car pulled up at the gate, Agatha didn't rush out. She waited exactly 3 minutes, checked her hair one last time, and then walked down the path with an imperious grace that she hoped masked the slight ache in her ribs. James held the door open for her, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "You look remarkably recovered, Agatha," he said as they pulled away from the curb. "It's a matter of willpower, James." "And very expensive moisturizer," Agatha replied, settled back into the leather seat. "I refuse to let a woman who wears tartan sashes as a personality trait be the ruin of my social calendar." The drive to Merster was unusually quiet. James seemed preoccupied with the road, or perhaps with the staggering realization that his neighbour was a magnet for homicide. Agatha, for her part, was waiting for the compliment she felt she deserved. The one where he admitted she was brilliant, brave, and perhaps the most intriguing woman he'd ever met. Instead, as they reached the art gallery, he began a long, dry lecture on the evolution of Highland landscape painting in the 19th century. Agatha followed him through the hushed rooms of the gallery, her heels clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor. She tried to look interested in the oil paintings of misty glens and shaggy Highland cattle, but her mind kept drifting back to the village hall. She thought of Sheila's cold eyes and the smell of the poisoned haggis. Every time James pointed out the subtle use of light in a particular canvas, Agatha found herself looking for oily smudges or hidden flasks in the painted shadows. "It's about the truth behind the surface, isn't it?" she interrupted James mid-sentence as he droned on about a particular artist's brushwork. James blinked, looking at her in surprise. "I suppose so. Art is a form of truth in its own way." "I meant the village, James. Everyone sees the picturesque cottages and the church roof funds, but underneath, there's industrial poison and offshore accounts, and women who will kill you over a bridge club membership. It's a miracle we aren't all murdered in our beds by Tuesday." James sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Most people in Carsely are perfectly decent, Agatha. You just have a knack for finding the ones who aren't. Or perhaps you provoke them." "Provoke them?" Agatha's voice rose, earning a sharp hush from a passing gallery attendant. "I saved the village, James. I saved the mill. I saved you from having to attend a funeral for a neighbour you'd actually have to miss." James looked at her then, his gaze softening just enough to make Agatha's heart do a treacherous little somersault. "I know you did, Agatha, and I am grateful, in my own way. But surely you can enjoy a landscape without looking for a motive." They had tea afterward in a small, cramped shop that smelled of stale scones and damp umbrellas. James spoke of his latest chapter on the Peninsular War, and Agatha nodded in all the right places, though she was secretly wondering if the woman at the next table was wearing a wig or if she'd just had a very bad permanent wave. The romantic tension Agatha had hoped for remained exactly where it always was, simmering just beneath the surface, tantalizingly close, and yet entirely out of reach. When they returned to Carsely, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long golden shadows across the village green. James dropped her at her gate, the engine of his car idling with a polite, dismissive thrum. "Thank you for the day, Agatha," he said, his hand lingering on the gear stick. "It was informative." "Informative," Agatha repeated, her voice flat. "Well, I aim to educate, James. Good night." She watched him drive the short distance to his own garage, feeling the familiar mix of triumph and loneliness settle over her. She entered her cottage, the silence greeting her like an old, slightly tedious friend. She kicked off her heels, poured herself a generous glass of gin, and sat down in the armchair by the cold hearth. On the side table lay a small handwritten note that had been pushed through her door while she was out. It was from Mrs. Cartwright's bridge partner, a woman Agatha had always found particularly irritating. "Dear Agatha," it read, "we're all so relieved the unpleasantness is over. We're having a small gathering at the Red Lion on Friday to discuss the new nature reserve. We'd love for you to come, though perhaps you could leave your detective kit at home this time. We'd like to have one evening without a police presence." Agatha crumpled the note into a ball and tossed it toward the wastepaper basket. She missed, and the paper skittered across the floor. "Ingrates," she muttered, taking a long sip of her drink. She looked at her reflection in the dark window pane. She was bruised, she was tired, and she was currently the most unpopular hero in the county. But as she thought of the National Trust signs that would soon be going up at the old mill, and the look on Sheila's face when the handcuffs clicked, a slow, predatory smile spread across Agatha Raisin's face. She wasn't just a former PR executive, or a lonely neighbour. She was a force of nature in a midnight blue suit, and if Carsely thought they'd seen the last of her aging curiosity, they were in for a very rude awakening. She reached for the telephone to call Roy Silver. She had a sudden urge to find out if there were any interesting scandals brewing in the neighbouring village of Ancombe. After all, a woman of her experience couldn't be expected to sit by the fire forever.